welcome once again, fight fans, to another episode of Career Profiles with me, your host, Sean Bastow, as always joined by Johnston Brown for this episode on a true British boxing hero. This is Sir Henry Cooper. What a privilege and a pleasure it is to be able to sit down and go through the life and the boxing career of truly one of the nicest guys that has ever graced the squared circle. Before we get into this episode, as always, please go and follow us on social media at career_profiles on Twitter and the BTR Boxing Podcast Network on Facebook as well. If you've not already subscribed to the Career Profiles podcast, you can do so by checking us out on Apple Podcasts or even Google Podcasts, Spotify. You can get us on Stitcher, TuneIn, Player FM, Pocket Cast, Catsbox, whichever podcast app you're using, we're on there. If you are on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and leave us a review. It truly helps us get the word out about the podcast and spread it to all fellow boxing fans across the world. Well, without further ado then, this is a tale of the life and the times of a truly humble man. This is the career profile of Sir Henry Cooper.
Henry Cooper was the nicest human being God ever put on this earth.
What he was a champion in the hearts of all of those who knew him.
Decent human being, proper man.
That Henry hammer, the left hook, was a fantastic punch.
He had this wonderful left hand which could knock out anybody, including Muhammad Ali.
Nobody knocked Muhammad Ali down, you know. They couldn't catch him, but Henry caught him with his left hook.
He said, it didn't only shake me, it shook my relations in Africa.
He's knocked me down and I don't like it and I haven't forgot it and it really embarrassed me.
Bang.
Great left hand.
I'm really proud that I knew Henry Cooper. I'll tell you that. He was the tops.
A wonderful, warm, loving person. That was Henry Cooper.
Well, we're back again, Johnston, for another episode of Career Profiles. Another recommendation, but I'm going to be honest and admit I can't remember who gave us this recommendation. I don't know if it was you, Martin Lee, because you recommended loads to us. I can't remember if it was you or not, or if it was somebody else. But, as always, we totally appreciate the recommendations because it's another career which, you know, we both know quite a bit about, with him, you know, being from Britain, of course. But going into his career, like we do in these podcasts, gives us a hell of a lot more insight on things that we didn't know about him. And I know for you, Johnston, this is one you've been looking forward to because Henry Cooper was a guy who only lived down the road from you.
He was indeed, and he is one of my absolute idols. I can't tell you enough how much I actually adore this fella. Obviously, he fought another one of my favourites in Muhammad Ali, but he was just brilliant. He was brave in battle and dignified in defeat. And he had this, if he won or lost, he was graceful with it and modest. He was basically just the British public loved him. And so did I. A great fighter and a great guy, a gentleman, absolute gentleman, in and outside the ring, even with that deadly left hook.
Now, of course, as always, we do the Career Profiles podcast by going through their lives and times in and outside of the ring chronologically to give you more of a flavour of what these people were all about. So for Henry Cooper, he was born on May the 3rd, 1934, 20 minutes before his twin brother George, at the General Lying In Hospital maternity ward in Westminster, London. Now, even though his mother, Lily, had received a hint that she may conceive twins during a scan, she actually failed to believe it was possible, so was pleasantly surprised when they arrived. A nurse had noted that they looked to be likely lads, and the nurse was quoted as saying, "You mark my words, these two will be 6-footers." And she wasn't wrong. And as for naming these two, Lily recalled later that it was a maternity nurse who actually thought of the names Henry and George in that order. Ironically, both were Cooper family names. Their father was called Henry William Cooper, and his dad, Henry's granddad, was also called George.
Yeah, quite ironic that she came up with her names, and that the Cooper family did have a rich heritage in boxing, which dates back to George, whose main passion was singing, horses, drinking, and fighting. He fought with middleweight. Sometimes singing and boxing at the same night, earning a nice few bob as well. And he was inspired by a historic bare knuckle prize fight between Irishman Daniel Donnelly and George Cooper. Now, I couldn't quite remember if this was a relation or if this was just a story. It's just ironic that it was the Cooper name, I'm not sure. But this fight between Donnelly and Cooper, allegedly in front of 20,000 spectators in the year of the Battle of Waterloo, which was 1815. Now, these two men fought at the Carré, which was outside Dublin, and it was an encounter that both passed into legend and was commemorated into a ballad that describes their meeting. The ballad was sung to George by his mother Bridget, and in turn, he would do the same for his family.
While a lead rider in the King's Troop of the Royal Horse Artillery, Henry William Cooper inevitably followed in his father's footsteps and became a useful welterweight, winning the Brigade Championships. He served for the RHA for 7 years before joining civilian life in 1926. On his return, his father George passed away. That same year, he moved to Newington and moved in next door to Lily Nutkin's family, and they began courting and were married a year later at St John's Church on May the 8th, 1927. The Cooper family were living in a council house on the Bellingham estate at 120 Farmstead Road in southeast London when World War II began in September 1939. When the first German air attacks, imminent, which would last 60 days, resulting in 600,000 casualties, plans were made during the war outbreak to move 1.25 million women and children from the major inner cities and evacuate into the rural or suburban areas before the airstrikes commenced. Older brother, Bernard, aka Byrne, Henry and George, now 5, arrived in Lancing on the Sussex coast in early 1940, with Byrne staying in one house and the twins in another. Now the twins' new landlady and Mrs. Holland see their presence as an inconvenience, along with 6 other guests, including a 3-month-old baby. It was a very difficult time, but Henry and George formed an even stronger bond during time away from their family. Henry quoted as saying, "If you've got a twin brother, you've always got a friend. We've always been together. We were born together. We went to school together. We were never parted." Henry remembers living off jam sandwiches and attending the local school, with the only other attraction being the seaside town and beach. But that was completely off limits due to the possible German invasion, of course. So it was a miserable time for Henry, who recalls his time as an evacuee, and he says, "We all had to sleep across the same bed. This little baby would wake us up at some ungodly hour, and I'll never forget the smell of that stuff they bring up. It would throw up all over the sheet, and she'd just wipe it down and the sheet over, and I can still smell it now."
Don't sound to have been a pleasant time for Henry and George, and obviously split from their brother Byrne as well as their parents. So it was a really tough time for them, as millions and millions of other families during this. It was a dreadful time. I mean, you can't even imagine really. And Lily and Henry Senior were only able to actually visit the boys once or twice due to their lack of funds, which basically must have been really difficult for the family, as I just said, and as many others during the sort of this time. And their Farmstead Road home in Bellingham, which is, as you said, literally was up the road. I mean, I know Bellingham so well; it's crazy. It was an early casualty, their Bellingham home, of the German night bombings, and the house was actually hit by a parachute mine while Henry Senior was working late on the tram, and by pure luck, Lily was actually just visiting a neighbour. So it just shows you that when they were evacuated, it was the right thing to do. And the house was now in ruins, and it would take 18 months for it to be repaired, but they managed to find an accommodation through a work colleague of Henry Senior. If things couldn't get any worse, Henry Senior actually crushed 3 of his fingers on a rolling mill while in his new job following the move to a flat in Grove Park, which is literally up the road from Bellingham. It's not far at all, leaving him unable to work. While in receipt of some modest compensation of only £2 a week sick pay, they decided to call the boys back home from Sussex.
We got bombed out. Well, damaged. The house was so damaged we couldn't live there. So we moved to a flat in Grove Park.
They were running to the shelter and the doodle bug went off behind them. And I think
George got blown into the shelter. Byrne was already just getting into the shelter, and Dad hit the top of the shelter when the blast blew him off and knocked him out.
Whenever a warning went, Mum used to give us a cushion, and we had to put this cushion on, and we had to run from there to get into the shelter, and you could hear all the shrapnel like as the guns were going full blast. We were lucky we never actually got hit by shrapnel, but thank God Mum gave us the old cushion which saved us.
By the autumn of 1941, Farmstead Road was ready for reoccupation, and the family were finally reunited again, although forced to live on the breadline. And Henry was quoted as saying, "We was rough and ready kids. Money was a bit short. Mum, she was out scrubbing, washing, doing anything to get money." Now, they enjoyed a good year together before Henry Sr. was called up for service in Burma to the Royal Army Medical Corps in 1942, where he would spend nearly 3 years. Now, Lily worked 3 jobs to keep her hungry trio fed, while constantly dreading the possibility of a telegram from the War Office about Henry Sr. Mum would queue up at the butcher's and buy a sheep's head for 10 pence, and out of that she could feed us all. It was amazing what she could do with it, recalled Henry. Henry and George attended the Athenley Road School, and although they were never bullied because they were identical twins, which was uncommon, they did find themselves in a few scraps. Henry's first knockout actually came in a playground at Athenley Road School during a handball game, and he recalls it by saying, "Suddenly, a little fellow called Bridges jumped on my back and started throwing punches. I got a bit of a temper on and I dragged him over to me and I punched him in the eye. I knocked him out. Another fellow rushed over, but George held him off." And the only subject that Henry was remotely interested in was actually history, but school was more of an inconvenience compared to street life during the blackout.
Yeah, it's crazy, difficult times, but the kids, you hear the stories. I remember talking about history. I remember in history hearing the stories of some of the evacuees, some of those kids. I mean, it was hard for them, but they seemed to enjoy it. It's crazy. It was stuff to do, I suppose. And all 3 brothers began working to support their dear mum. And before school, it would be a paper round. After school, it would be errand running. And at the weekends, it would be a mixture of odd jobs, which is conserving scraps of coal and coke from the local power station, queuing for various food shops, collecting randomly packaged relief parcels from the American Red Cross, recycling horse manure, which apparently was quite to do with it. I got quite a few bob on that, or recycling golf balls on the old Beckenham golf course. And anyone from these neck of the woods, they will know that very well too. That was literally across the road from my school. But every bit of money they could get in their pocket was vital. Now there was a bomb which was called the V1 flying bomb, and they called it the Doodle Bug. Now this was a prototypical cruise missile powered by a simple pulse rocket motor. It would deliver half a ton of high explosive warhead sufficient to destroy 3 or 4 terraced houses. Londoners became accustomed to the doodle bugs because of the noise, and when one approached, Lily had a plan, and her plan was to run to the flimsy Anderson shelter with a chair cushion wrapped over their head to reduce the damage from debris that was falling from the sky in splinters. It does make me laugh. You could just imagine it. Now, it would be this very V1 that almost took the life of Henry Cooper on one clear Saturday afternoon in the summer of 1944. He and his brother Byrne were out selling football pool coupons close to home when they heard the doodle bug overhead. It cut out because you'd hear it fly over and basically it would just cut out. As soon as they heard it cut out, they knew it's above them, it's going to blow. And they run to the Anderson shelter for cover and almost made it until bang. Henry was literally slammed up against the structure and knocked out, while Byrne got an arse full of glass. Both came through hurt, but alive, luckily. But yeah, sounds crazy, but he actually laughs about it when he actually speaks about it as well, old Henry.
When we was, 15, 16, I suppose, naturally we had mates. So on a Saturday evening, they'd say, well, we're getting ready, we're going dancing tonight. Well, I wouldn't go dancing. I always thought, well, I've got to go training Sunday morning, so I'll be in bed, 9:30, 10 o'clock. I didn't mind doing that because, boxing was my life at the time.
He was really left-handed, but he boxed orthodox. That's why he has so much power in the left hook, because that was his big hitting shot. But he should have been this way around instead of that way around.
He was 16-year-old and he was fighting blokes of 24, 25, you know. Great big flows.
As an amateur, he's very good. He won 2 ABA titles, 51 and 52 light heavyweight titles. And then he went to the Helsinki Olympic Games, and then him and his brother George turned professional.
When the newer version of the V1 came out, the V2, Henry recalls its destruction through the eyes of a young, innocent lad. The day we heard Lewisham Woolworths had caught it with the V2 rocket, we all ran all the way there, about 3 miles. It was one of the worst tragedies of the war. They were bringing out bits of bodies, and as one of the rescue workers came out with a carrier bag, we were told he had a head in it. We'd go back and play afterwards. You know, it could happen to you, but it didn't keep you awake at nights, and it didn't seem to penetrate. I suppose we were too young to have any deep feelings about it. Henry Sr. finally made a safe return home in late 1944 to the relief of Lily and the end of the war a year later in 1945. Now, all 3 brothers were sporty. Byrne preferred athletics, whereas the twins excelled at football and cricket, but their real love was boxing. Henry Sr. had no objection and was all for letting his boys follow in his footsteps, as he did his father, and his before that. Boxing was a part of the Cooper DNA. It was in the blood. Their neighbour Robert Hill, he was a fireman and a boxing scout for the Bellingham Boxing Club, and he noticed Henry and George, aged 9, sparring in the streets. They would wrap football socks around their fists for protection, and Robert approached Henry Sr. and asked if he would allow the twins to join the club. He was so adamant of their ability that he paid their subscriptions up for the first year.
Wow, they were strapping lads. I mean, even at that age, I'm sure being a scout, you could probably tell from their physique and probably the way they threw a punch. Now, by the time the twins were in their teens, they were regulars at the Bellingham Boxing Club, and their trainer, Matt Wells, a former British lightweight champion himself, had a philosophy of a strict training regime, which included running, skipping, bag work and speedball. But no sparring. That would come later once they were disciplined and acclimatised to the atmosphere of the gym. Now, trouble was they were eager to get going, so much so that Henry got knocked out at home. He tells a story. He says, Mum was trying to cook and we were larking around and George actually swung a punch at me. As I've gone back quick, I hit my head on the gas stove and knocked myself out. That was the first time I'd ever been knocked out. Mum gave us a wallop after. You can imagine she gave a pretty hard wallop, I'm guessing.
Well, the twins left school in 1949, aged 15, and joined the Eltham District Amateur Boxing Club, where they were taken under the wing of head trainer George Page and would remain so for their entire amateur careers. And Henry recalls the days in the Eltham gym, and he said, in the early days I was about 8 or 9 stone, and I was in against this kid of 7.5 stone. He was no thicker than my little finger, and I thought, he'll do lovely. I went in like a bull in a china shop, but this kid was a schoolboy champion, and I had more left hands in my face than I ever thought possible. I never landed a glove on him, but George and me were keen, and we were back the next week. And what this of course taught Henry was that he needed the ability to channel his aggression, as he describes it. Where boxing is chiefly character building is in the ring, where no kid can afford to lose his temper. If he does, 9 times out of 10, he'll be punished more. You go berserk and bonk, your opponent is just picking you off. They're certainly very wise words from Henry Cooper.
They really are, and if any young aspiring boxers out there, you know, he's definitely a guy to look at and just read. I mean, listen to this, and you can see just how wise he was. And Henry enjoyed Eltham, but he needed an acid test, and that came in 1951 when he beat P.C. Trevelyan, the national police champion at light heavyweight. Henry and George were beginning to show their potential, and while no money was ever won, they were forming a decent collection of domestic utilities. The prize winnings, which came in handy for basically around Christmas time. And this was all well and good, but they needed to get jobs and earn some money for the family. They started work at Sydenham Gasworks, which again, Sydenham Gasworks was literally down the road. And even in Gemma's family, my wife, her granddad actually painted the Sydenham Gasworks. That's just really crazy hearing this neck of the woods, and he's from my ends basically. And they moved into roofing. Where Henry actually broke his left elbow. He actually broke it, and then it splintered, and it actually splintered so bad that it remained in his arm all the way through his career, which is just crazy. And before George Page directed the twins to Ray Reynolds, who run a successful plastering contractors business. Now, the trade actually helped their boxing. Henry plastered with his left hand and George with his right. The arm movements developed the right muscles, which mirrored their gym work. So it was perfect training for these two when they were just about to move into the ABAs.
By April 1952, Henry was the Amateur Boxing Association, otherwise known as the ABA, champion, and he was selected to represent Great Britain at the Helsinki Olympics as a light heavyweight. His first bout was scratched, so he progressed into the second round against the Russian Anatoly Perov, who he lost to on a 2-1 split decision. Although he was disappointed, he was able to enjoy the games and witness two future opponents. The first was Floyd Patterson at 17. He was one of the youngest competitors, winning the middleweight gold. And the second was Ingemar Johansson, who was thrown out of the competition for not trying.
Yeah, strange story. Something I never knew, actually. And yeah, Johansson actually got thrown out for not trying it's weird, a really strange one. An amateur boxing journalist of the Evening News was a certain guy called J.T. Holes. Now, he kept a close eye on the twins, and due to the British Boxing Board of Control rules that a fighter had to have a manager on record to turn professional, he passed on his advice. Now, he would actually go round the Cooper's household with the twins there and just literally say to them, look, when you turn over, make sure you speak to me, kind of thing. And his advice was, there is only one man to manage you, and that man is Jim Wicks. Now, Holes arranged a meeting with Wicks, the twins, and George Page, and they discussed the possibility of turning over. They wanted advice from Wicks on their scheduled spell in the Ordnance Corps, which was due to start in the summer of 1952. So their question to Wicks was, should they turn pro before or after the national service? And Henry remembers his response, and he said, if you go into the army as professionals, you won't get any concessions. If you box for them as amateurs, you'll go here, there, and everywhere. As a pro, you wouldn't be allowed to box for them. They decided to stay amateur and report for duty at the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, which is the RAOC department at Blackdown Barracks, which was outside Aldershot. Now, they opted for the Irish Guards, but they were cunningly diverted to the 4th Battalion RAOC. The main reason was because the 4th was known as the Boxers Battalion. Now, Henry said, I did very little soldiering, I must confess. Every morning after the parade, it was boxers, fall out.
Now, the twins managed to return home to Bellingham most weekends and were permitted to fight in London at the ABA events during the week. And it was in May 1953 that Henry beat the Australian Tony Madigan to clinch his second ABA light heavyweight championship, with Jim Wicks in the audience witnessing Henry for the first time. He told me later that he thought I had a decent left hand and that I moved well against a two-handed fighter like Madigan, but I thought he had forgotten us really. A two-time ABA champ was going good, but in the European Amateur Championship in Warsaw, he lost to another Russian just like in Helsinki, but this time he was stopped in the first round against Yuri Zhagarov. Henry reflected on his Olympic and European exits by saying, I never did any good at all in either the Olympics or the European Championships. Looking back, I suppose the atmosphere was different. There were big occasions, and I hadn't yet learned to relax, to leave the worrying to others. Henry Cooper ended his amateur career with 84 fights and 73 wins.
Not a bad amateur career. He's done really well. Having kept contact, obviously, with Holes, the twins were determined to now turn pro following their return home from the army service in the summer of 1954. They wanted Wicks as their manager, even though another manager, who was Sam Burns, had followed their careers with interest. They politely declined and signed with Wicks live on the BBC Sports View programme. Wicks was pleased with his new heavyweights, George with the powerful right hand, and Henry possessed that blistering left. Now, even with a boxing contract and a future in the sport, looking like a decent earner, they still shared a room at home in Bellingham. and carried on working for Reg Reynolds, who basically was quite content to allow them, with a bit of flexibility, to do their hours as well as train. He was a keen boxing fan as well, and he could tell that these guys were going to be something, and it was something for them to rely on, a bit of plastering if anything went tits up, and they've got something to fall back on.
Now, Jim Wick's headquarters was the mecca of boxing south of the river. Thomas Abeke, a pub on the Old Kent Road, where he leased the first floor function room and converted it into a boxing gym. Wicks had a stable of Jake Tully, the British and Empire bantamweight champion, British light heavyweight champ Alex Buxton, and British lightweight Joe Lucy. Wick's senior trainer was Danny Holland, and a master of dealing with cuts, someone that would be vital for Henry in his future. Along with Wicks, there were two other big-time promoters on the scene, Jolly Jack Solomons and Harry Levine, and they detested each other. It sounds very familiar to this day and age, with Hearn and Warren, of course. Wicks, on the other hand, was able to do business with both, making it easier to navigate the twins' career. Henry was full of admiration for Wicks from the start. Managers were entitled to 25% of a purse after expenses, although those early fights, until we were earning, say, 400 or 500 quid or so for a fight. Jim Wicks, bless his heart, didn't take a penny off us. We actually kept it all. Henry Cooper made his professional debut on September the 14th, 1954, in a 6th round on Jack Solomon's promotion at the Haringey Arena against Harry Painter, who was 13 and 15. Jim's advice to Henry was, take it easy and relax, don't try to over-impress. Henry hit Harry to the chin with a left that put him down before knocking him out in the first round. And it's funny because George also fought on that card, making his debut under Jim Cooper, because there was another George currently on the circuit, strangely enough. And Henry said, I think we had about £100 between us, so off we went out and bought Mum and Dad a television set. I think we were the last people in Farmstead Road to have one, Henry recalled. Training was intense to improve fitness and be ready for the duration as rounds increased, so Wicks invented a disgusting cocktail that he believed would be beneficial for energy and stamina. It was a double port, blended with a pint of Guinness. It's a shame that they couldn't have invented a way of keeping Henry and George's prominent eyebrows from getting caught as often as they did, something that will always be an issue as we go throughout the course of this career profile of Henry Cooper, and would prove so 3 years later.
Yeah, it certainly would. And on April 26, 1955, Henry had an almost perfect record of 9 victories out of 9 fights, all but 2 inside the distance. His first defeat came that evening at the hands, or rather the head, of the Italian OBE KSG, who was 14-7-6 at the Haringey Arena. Now, Henry was cut in the second round, and Wicks did not hesitate to throw in the towel. It was a matter of saving for another day, and Henry would get his own back on the Italian KSG when he knocked him out in the 7th in their rematch in September, after stopping Ron Harmon, who was 14-1-1 in June. Now, on November 15, Henry Cooper and Joe Erskine, who was 24-0-1, met for the first time in a professional ring. They had met previously in the amateurs, and it was an elimination for the British heavyweight title. Now, after 10 rounds of close action, Cooper lost by decision and fell to a career record now of 11-2. Now, predominantly, Henry had fought on the Jolly Solomon's cards, but Harry Levine finally managed to promote a Cooper fight, which is something he was really eager to do, in February 28th, 1956 at the Royal Albert Hall, that lovely venue. And the opponent was a French champion who was Maurice Malls, who was 10-10-1. Now, Henry had an easy night's work, knocking the Frenchman down 4 times in the 4th with that trademark left hooks to the body this time. Now, the victory was important as it enabled Wicks to negotiate a fight with the undefeated Brian London, who was 12-0, who was highly regarded in the north of England, coming from Blackpool, I believe, which made a bit of needle between the two. When asked if he planned to knock London out, as in Henry Cooper, someone from the press asked him, they asked him what round, Cooper responded by holding up one finger and saying, "Just one," said Henry. True to his word, he came out throwing with intent, and that big left hand landed on the button, and London hit the deck and the fight was stopped as he tried to return to his feet.
Well, less than 2 months later, on June the 26th, he stopped Italian Gianni Orlando Luis, who's 19-3-1, in the 7th round with another left to the body. And everything seemed to be going hunky-dory for him after these 2 victories, but Henry's career was about to hit a roadblock. And it all started at Bellevue here in Manchester against Peter Bates, who was 22-6-1 on September the 7th, 1956. And things seemed to be going pretty swimmingly, with Henry putting the Yorkshireman down in the opening round and then winning the next 4, until the 5th, when a serious cut opened up over Henry's right eye. Cut to the bone, Wicks made the right call and threw in the towel. And after a 5-month layoff, Henry then faced the muscular Jamaican Joe Bygraves, who was 34-9, in a rematch Henry had won on points 2 years prior at Earl's Court for the British Empire heavyweight title. Once again, a cut opened in round 3, but it was a solar plexus punch in the 9th that put Henry down twice before being counted out.
Yeah, and in the audience of that fight was the European champion Ingemar Johansson, who you would have thought would have been waiting for the winner, but the EBU instructed that he defended his title against Henry Cooper in front of 10,000 Swedes in an outside arena in Stockholm. Johansson landed his famous hammer of 4 in the 5th round on Henry's chin. He basically never see it coming, and scribe Peter Wilson wrote, "He was like a man who had touched the live terminal of high voltage wire, and he was shocked out of his senses. Henry didn't make up any excuses. He actually said, it was so quick, I just didn't see it coming. 3 defeats on the spin, but yet Henry found himself fighting for the British and the Commonwealth, or as they called it back then, the Empire titles, in his next fight, and it was a rematch against Joe Erskine, who was now 31-1, back at the Haringey Arena. Now, it was not a fight to remember. Many say that it was a pretty dull affair. It was not a fight to remember. The Welshman Erskine won a very narrow decision over 15 rounds, making it 4 losses on the spin for Henry.
Now at this point, Henry Cooper's 14-6 on his professional record, and he began to doubt himself, and he actually seriously considered quitting the sport altogether, until Jim Wicks gave him some advice about his excessive use of the left hook, and he said, "Just let them feel the wind of it passing, son. Just the wind of it passing. Just let them know it's there." A cause for concern was the persistent cuts, but his cutsman Danny Holland created a remedy. An adrenaline compound mixed with Vaseline ensured that it nearly broke off broken blood and would last most of the 3-minute rounds. With Holland's new solution, and Wicks standing by his man, the next logical step was to go to Germany and rebuild. Henry went on then and beat the German champion Hans Kalbreth, 18-3 at the time, comprehensively on points, in front of a large contingent of British soldiers who actually hoisted Henry up in celebration. The following year, at the beginning of 1958, Henry fought German veteran Heinz Neuhaus, who was 41-7-6, to a dodgy draw before facing the unbeaten Erich Schnoppner, who was 20-0-1 draw in his record, in Frankfurt on April the 19th, 1958. Now, Henry knocked out Schnoppner out cold in the 6th with a nasty left hook that actually hospitalised him for 5 weeks. Strangely enough, Cooper was actually disqualified for rabbit punching, and he was fined £700. So 1 win, 1 draw, and 1 loss was the result of that trip over to Germany, although it should have been 3 wins. It didn't matter though, as Henry had found this new confidence and belief in himself again, which was far more important for his career.
It was those 4 defeats on the bouncing and going to Germany. It doesn't sound great, 1-1, but I think the draw, it was added some crazy rule over there where you had to win by 5 rounds to win it. So he won the fight. I think he won it by like 4 rounds. He got done, and he knocked the geezer out and still gets disqualified. It's crazy. Inevitably, Henry returned to England and was ready for another comeback, which started against Welshman Dick Richardson, who was 25-7-2 in Coney Beach Arena in Porthcawl on the South Wales coast. After being floored in the 4th, Henry delivered the best left hook of his career so far to Richardson's chin, and his feet actually left the canvas, resulting in him being knocked out cold. Even the Welsh crowd cheered for Henry Cooper that night. It was after this fight that Jim Wicks named Henry Cooper's left hook Henry's hammer, and Harry Levine was extremely keen to promote another Henry Cooper fight, and he agreed with a certain Chris Dundee. That's the brother of Angelo Dundee, who was at that moment in time a promoter for a certain Sonny Liston. But when he put the idea to Wicks, he was quick to turn it down after being tipped off by his American friend, who was Jim Norris, about the dangerous big bear Sonny Liston. Now, Wicks said, "I'm not going to let my boy fight that mahogany wardrobe. We don't want to meet this geezer walking down the street, let alone in the ring. He's too ugly. We only take on good-looking boys."
Oh, you certainly wouldn't get away with saying that in this day and age, would you?
Definitely not.
Oh, my goodness. That's just pure casual racism going on there from
Dreadful.
Jim Wicks. Now, finally, a fight was signed to fight an American, not Archie Moore, who they'd hoped they could persuade over to England, but the excellent Zora Foley, who was 41-2-2 at the Empire Pool in Wembley on October the 14th, 1958. The winner would earn a shot at the world title, currently held by Floyd Patterson. Once again, Henry was plagued by the cuts as it was open, and he was put down to the canvas in the third round. It seemed only a matter of time before Foley finished off the job, but Henry actually managed to turn the tide, and Holland kept his cuts at bay, which enabled Henry to claw back the early rounds going into the 10th and final round. It was a toe-to-toe slugfest, with both fighters a mess. When the bell sounded, the fighters could not hear due to the crowd's roar of approval. Referee Tommy Little did not hesitate. He raised Henry's arm in victory, and the New York Times wrote, "Then came one more great gust of sound as Cooper's hand was raised in triumph, and we were all left to marvel of what we had seen."
And what a fantastic win against Zora Foley. I mean, I know they wanted Archie Moore, and obviously Sonny Liston was a possibility, but Zora was a great fighter, and he was tapping on the door of that heavyweight title, which Cuss, obviously, we'll speak about in a sec, didn't want anyone to really have a go at Patterson. Now, after a great victory over a quality opponent, a world title shot should have been granted, but Cuss D'Amato, as in Floyd Patterson's manager, decided to look elsewhere, which meant it was back to the British and the Empire heavyweight titles instead, against old foe Brian London, who was now 22-3. It was nothing like the first. It was a brutal, bloody bloodbath over 15 punishing rounds, with Henry Cooper winning on points. Henry recalled, "It took more out of me than any other fight in my career. I felt worse after this, more exhausted and in more pain than with any other. It took me weeks to recover. I was swollen up and sore. I couldn't even wear trousers for over a week. The world heavyweight scandal was rife. Brian London was actually awarded a title shot against Floyd Patterson and not Henry Cooper after this fight."
Wow. So again, boxing politics and corruption was so rife at this period of time. Things that we've covered for our Darker Side of Boxing with the mysterious life and death of Sonny Liston, of course. So going back to Cooper then, of course, and Cooper's first defence of the British Empire title was a 5th round stoppage of South African Gawie de Klerk, who was 16-3 after landing his Henry's hammer. He broke the guy's jaw in 2 places. And a third fight with Joe Erskine, who's now 36-3-1, was next at Earl's Court on November the 17th, 1959, and Henry finally got the better of his nemesis. Now, once again, Henry was cut, but it was contained until the 12th when he dropped Erskine twice and then unleashed a left-right combination to his jaw, which left him draped over the bottom rope, completely sparko. Henry showed his caring side, saying, "We were really worried. We were convinced that Joe had broken his back." And as the decade came to a close, Henry Cooper was the British and Empire heavyweight champion and was engaged to Albina Ginprey, and the pair tied the knot in January of 1960. They moved to Wembley, and George moved in with them. It was a good year for Henry. He defeated Roy Harris, who was 29-3, and Alex Maitev, who was 22-6-1, and then won the 4th fight with Joe Erskine, who was now 38-4-1 in 1961, by knockout, making it 2 apiece. And then he owned the Lonsdale belt as a result outright for defending it 3 times. Henry then became a father to his son, Henry Marco, and spent more time at home, which coincided with a 9-month layoff.
Yeah, and he did stay a lot of time at home. I think he was trying to recuperate. He had some problems with the shoulder, with the elbow, with the cuts. And obviously he hadn't seen his family, his newborn son, wanted to be with his wife. It makes sense. So he done a little bit of training. He didn't train very well, to be fair. And the rematch with Zora Foley peered its head, and he was Zora Foley now 55-5-2. And the fight happened on December 5th, 1961 at the Wembley Pool in London. Wembley Pool, I believe it's Wembley. Obviously, it will be at Wembley. It's in London. Yeah, of course it is. And it was another wake-up call for Henry, who, as I said, who admitted that he undertrained. Now, Foley, on the other hand, was more than ready to seek his revenge, and it came in the second round with a shot that connected with Henry's jaw and ear, and he simply dropped to the floor like a sack of shit. It literally was a brutal. It's a great shot. There is something out there. I'm sure I caught it on YouTube, not too recently, but I've definitely seen this punch, and it was a lot like the hammer of Thor from Johansson, and literally like that all over again. And Henry did say, I didn't see that punch at all. All I remember was Foley coming close to me, and I found myself on the floor. I suppose I should have to start all over again. That was what he said. And now, before the Foley fight, Henry Cooper was actually ranked as the 3rd best heavyweight in the world. After the defeat, he dropped to number 6. I think the only one was number 2 was Liston. So if he had won that fight, he would have literally jumped over Sonny Liston at this point. He needed to get back to winning ways and fast. And Wicks lined up Tony Hughes, who was 24-1 on January 1962. Wayne Beatty, who was 24-16-2 in February. And then Joe Erskine once again, who was 39-5-1 in April. Now, Henry retired Hughes in 5, outpointed Bertha over 10, and won a 5th and the final fight with Erskine in 9 rounds. Obviously, taking that series almost, isn't it? 5-fight series, 3-2. Now, the pace slowed right down following the Erskine victory due to another cut on the eye, which was and a split in the knuckle, and also the recurring shoulder injury, which with his elbow, and that was literally from the roofing accident that he had as a teenager where he broke his arm. Now, it would be the best part of a year before Henry would return, and it was a rematch with Dick Richardson, who was 31-13-2, who found himself on the end of, once again, that Arizama in the 5th round, and basically the referee called it unfit to continue.
Round 5. This will be a total annihilation.
Any special training, Cassius?
No special training. Just be at the fight. I'm ready to back up everything I'm saying, and I'm through talking.
There's always in boxing, there's all the hype and all that dancing around, the show business, selling tickets, and nobody's better at that than Ali.
Muhammad Ali was not your normal heavyweight boxer.
I am the greatest. I cannot be beat. I'm pretty. If you keep talking jive, you'll fall in 5.
If Cooper gives me any jive, he'll fall in 5. Well, the Britain of that era hated that kind of thing.
Picking around was something that got people attention. That's what we did it for.
What people don't understand today, that at that time, Cassius Clay was hated in this country.
See, people don't understand, I pushed Muhammad to talk. He was the first superstar to talk.
We were a reserved nation, modest, our sportsmen were modest. Henry epitomised the British sportsman.
And he was always kind about his opponents, very modest about them.
Yeah, it's going to be a good fight. Let's go in there and just have it and do it. If he wins, he wins. If he loses, he loses, you know.
Naturally, I want it to go as short as possible. I mean, if it goes 15 rounds, well, I hope to be there and be the winner after 15 rounds.
You're going to go down there, I'm going to get you, and that stuff was, we were looking to sell.
And the people got so mad. And that night of the fight, cars would come. People would be paying $100 for a seat. And I said, Angelo, how much money is here? He said, the place is sold out. I said, that's good, it worked.
We go into an arena, Muhammad and I, and boo, boo, boo. He said, geez, there's people here.
These 40 or 50,000 people in Wembley are all on Henry Cooper's side.
The crown and the robe, my thinking. You got the queen, I got the king. So, there you go. There was nothing. There was no harm, man. Believe me, there was no insult to anybody.
On June 18th, 1963, a certain Cassius Clay, 18-0, arrived in England to face Henry, and the fight would be held at Wembley Stadium in front of a crowd of 35,000 people. Clay, as we now know him as Muhammad Ali, was in great form as usual, telling the press, "This will be an annihilation. If the bum don't fall in 5, I won't come back to this nation." Now, during a dinner in Soho restaurant, Clay also said, "I'm real mad. The way I've been received, I stick to all I said about Cooper." Henry, on the other hand, was calm and philosophical on the eve of the fight, and he said, "I appreciate what Clay's done for the box office, but tomorrow night at 9:30 we'll be equals. Before the night is much older, I expect to prove that the lip is a better talker than a fighter." The banter, of course, didn't stop, and at the weigh-in at the London Palladium, Clay was wearing a crown, the same one that we'd wear into the ring during his entrance. Henry had trained harder than ever for this fight, so much so that he actually came in under his normal £180. Wicks inserted 2.5 pounds of lead plates into Henry's boxing boots and also slipped him a lump of lead to conceal in each hand, which mean he weighed in at 183.5 pounds versus Clay's 207 pounds. Now in the fight, Cooper started fast, something that he was unaccustomed to, taking the first 3 rounds, but Clay did open up a cut in the second on Henry's left eye, which worsened with persistent jabs. Moving into the fourth with seconds remaining, Cooper unleashed his Henry's hammer. The punch landed bang on Clay's jaw and he fell backwards onto the ropes and then down. He got up at the count of 4 and then the bell sounded. There was pandemonium in Wembley Stadium. When Clay returned to his corner, Angelo Dundee did not hesitate in the use of smelling salts, even though it was forbidden under the British Boxing Board of Control rules. Dundee then brought attention to a small tear in Clay's left glove near the thumb. He would later admit, "When he came to the corner, I gave him smelling salts. Then I helped the split a little, pulled it to the side and made the referee aware that there was a torn glove. I don't know how much time it got us, maybe a minute, but it was enough." The extended interval was 66 seconds made that difference, as Clay had actually recovered enough to pound away at Henry's left eye, which was now pouring with blood. The referee, Tommy Little, had no option but to stop the fight. Clay's excuse for being knocked down at first was, "I was looking at Liz Taylor at ringside." But then he spoke seriously for a moment and he said, "Cooper was great. The toughest I have met by a long, long way. The punch which put me down was the hardest one I have ever taken. He shut me up. He hit me harder than I've ever been hit. Then sometime after, the punch Cooper hit me with, he just didn't shake me. He shook me back to my relations in Africa."
Brilliant.
Absolutely brilliant from Muhammad Ali, of course, at this point. And of course, Clay shook up the world with victory over Sonny Liston in his next fight to become the world heavyweight champion. For Henry Cooper, he needed to take the rest of the year off so he could heal his damaged left eyebrow properly.
Wow, what a fantastic fight. I mean, 1963. The amount of times I've seen that punch is just a great shot, and you do wonder if that was a bit if there was an extra 15 seconds or if that was a bit closer to the middle of the ring, how much that would have changed and whether Henry Cooper would have gone on to fought Sonny Liston. Who knows? But what an amazing moment in sporting history. And Henry Cooper returned on February 24th, 1964 for a third and final encounter with another nemesis who was Brian London, 30-10, in defence of his Empire and British titles, but also for the European title, which was actually vacated by this point by Johansson following his retirement. Now, after 15 rounds, Henry Cooper won comfortably on points with no real problems with his eye. And he was basically now the king of Europe, but not for very long. Now, the EBU actually stripped him of his title for pulling out of a fight against German Karl Mildenberger due to a last-minute injury to his left eye on the advice of 2 specialists. So a bit of a shocker there. Now, Henry should have used this time to basically take the advice of those specialists and recuperate for longer, but instead chose to fight American Roger the Dodger Richter, who was 26-8-2. I do wonder why he's called the Dodger, or Dodged service. And this happened in November. And Henry spoke of this fight. "If anyone asked me which fight of my career I want to remember the least, it was this one. It was a poor performance from Cooper, who lost clearly on points.
Interestingly, Wicks received an unexpected call. Malcolm X, who was a close friend of the now Muhammad Ali, and he was trying to negotiate a fight. Wicks agreed to meet with him in Marylebone, but nothing actually came of it before referring him to Harry Levine. Malcolm X would be executed at the end of February 1965. Henry fought 6 times after the defeat to Risher, winning 5 inside the distance and losing once on points to Amos Johnson, who was 19-3-2, in a controversial decision by referee Harry Gibbs. It was after this defeat that Henry was issued with an invitation by the Queen to have lunch at Buckingham Palace, a clear indication of just how popular Henry Cooper had become.
Yeah, and the fight before the Muhammad Ali rematch was against a guy called Jefferson Davis, who was 26-7-1 at the Civic Hall in Wolverhampton. Now, this lasted just literally 100 seconds. Of course, it was that glorious left that ended the fight so quickly, and Henry Cooper extracted revenge for Davis beating his brother and collected the double, which is the double of a second Lonsdale belt outright. So his second Lonsdale belt outright. That's impressive stuff. That is really impressive. And Wicks began negotiations with a guy called Arthur Grafton, who was the attorney in Louisville who took care of contracts for the syndicate who still supported Muhammad Ali. Now, the fight was scheduled in the end for May 21st, 1966. And the fight would take place at Highbury Stadium, the old Highbury, the old Arsenal Football Club Stadium. And Henry Cooper was guaranteed 50,000 quid, with Ali being the heavyweight champion now. Double that, he got 100,000 quid. Now, cash value of the ticket sales actually surpassed those of Wembley World Cup final. That took place on the 30th of July 1966, as we know England beat the Germans. Henry Cooper had become the darling of the country, with some even suggesting that he was more important to the nation than the whole of the England football team.
Wow, that just goes to show you how much he was adored by the nation at this point in time, of course, with obviously England winning the World Cup was a huge thing. It's never been done since, and we came so close to it, didn't we, not too long ago, obviously, with the 2018 World Cup, but we've not done it since 1966. But for Henry Cooper to be put in the same esteem as the England football team, if not more, that just goes to show you how much he had really got to the nation's hearts. Now, Henry stayed at the Duchess of Edinburgh in Welling, Kent, accompanied by his brother George to prepare for the Ali fight. He also came up with a cunning plan to keep Ali quiet during the press conference, which was held at the Odeon in Leicester Square. No weights or lead was needed to disguise his natural weight, just a trick that he had to be taught by Max Bayer. Henry remembers this little trick. "Oh, look," said Henry. "He's a man, all right. He's got hair in his chest." And I gave it a tweak. It brought the house down. Ali was left emotionless. He couldn't quite believe that Henry Cooper had just pulled out one of his chest hairs, although there wasn't really much there, of course, at that point. It's a great moment from Henry Cooper. That
from Max Baer, isn't it? Definitely shut him up. Now, at the old Highbury Stadium, 55,000 were in attendance on the night, and even Henry Cooper's wife, Albina, actually attended for the first and the last time. She hated it. And the first thing that Henry noticed was the size of the crowd, and the national anthem was played out. And this is his words. He said, "As I stood there for the first time I can remember in the ring, I could feel a lump in my throat." Clearly emotional, that massive crowd, the nation behind him. And the other thing that he noticed was the size of the ring. It was massive. And you do notice it in the second fight. It seemed to take, this is Henry Cooper, by the way, he says it seemed to take 10 minutes just to arrive at the centre of it. You could have had 3 fights in there at the same time, said Henry Cooper. And the size of the ring was obviously chosen by Muhammad Ali and Angelo Dundee because, you know, they knew they needed to be much more savvier, and they needed to implement a style which meant to stay away from him. And that's basically what they did. Now, by round 5, Henry was marginally ahead on points. But by round 6, the worst thing happened. His eyebrow opened up yet again. But this time, it was worse than ever. Henry said it was the disappointment of my life. Referee Tommy Smith called a halt for a quick inspection before saying box on. But after another assault from Ali with them flicking jabs, just flicking away at it, who actually, you can see his face, he actually was quite disgusted by it, but he's targeting it, and it is awful, terrible cut, and the fight was finally stopped. The cut was so bad that it was cut once again to the bone. It's the second time that's happened to Henry Cooper, same eye as well, and Henry was sent to Guy's Hospital to have immediate plastic surgery, which took place the following day. Funnily enough, this would be the last time that Henry Cooper would be stopped on cuts, if only he had a surgery earlier. Who knows? Henry Cooper had now become, as the Associated Press or the British press called him, our Henry.
On September the 20th, 1966, Henry Cooper finally got his shot at Floyd Patterson, who was now 43-5 at the Empire Pool in Wembley. Henry started like a train for the first 2 rounds as he tried to connect on Patterson's supposedly weak jaw, but by the third, Patterson had found his distance and dictated the pace of the fight. By the end of the round, he put Henry down, and then down again in the fourth with what Henry called the finest punch he ever took. After getting up at the count of 9, he was jumped on with another right-left combination, but this time he was knocked out. Suddenly the lights went out, said Henry. He had a hell of a good punch, Patterson. Floyd Patterson, a lot like Henry Cooper, attended to him rather than celebrate with spectators moved by what they saw. Boxing News wrote, Floyd wanted to help him to his feet and later cuddled him and tried to console him. After fighting 2 of the best fighters boxing had ever seen, Henry countered the press talk of retirement by saying, if Ali and Patterson had been mugs, then I wouldn't have needed the press to tell me to go. But one was a world champion and the other was an ex-world champion, and there was no disgrace in losing to either of them.
Absolutely not, and Floyd Patterson clearly just as nice as Henry. Obviously concerned about his state. It was another hell of a punch, literally flattens him out on his front as well, sort of spins around, lands on his it's crazy. Henry turned his attentions back to the possibility of winning an unprecedented 3rd Lonsdale belt outright and become a 2-time European champion. Now, following the birth of another child, his son John Petro, Henry went on to do just that. Now, after stopping southpaw Jack Bordell was 41-8 in 2 rounds, and Billy Walco was 26-2, who was stopped in the 6th due to a bad cut himself, Henry collected his 3rd Lonsdale belt outright. A truly remarkable feat that will never be repeated ever in the sport. I can't see anyone sticking around with the Lonsdale belt and just collecting 3 of them. There's too many other stupid world titles about it. This is why that English title and the Lonsdale belt, it just shows you how highly regarded it was back then. And it was this accomplishment in 1967 that Henry Cooper voted as the Sports Personality of the Year, or Spotty, as we know. Now, in Henry's only fight in 1968, he captured that European title that was unfairly stripped from him against the guy who was supposed to meet originally, but he couldn't because of the injury, was Cole Mildenberger, who was 55-5-3. I believe he's a guy, I think he'd give Archie Moore a good fight, Mildenberger, if I remember rightly, and he was disqualified for illegal use of the head. Henry Cooper was now the British Empire and European heavyweight champion again.
This was probably, for me, the best moment of his career, really, other than obviously knocking Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali down in that first fight. Going on to win the British Empire and European Championships and holding them all at the same time was just an amazing feat, and which is why I think a lot of Brits really love the guy for what he was able to achieve in his career, given the fact that at this point in time people were saying he should retire. Now, by Christmas in 1968, Henry had to close his greengrocers, Henry Cooper of Wembley, because the business had fallen into debt due to his business partner, Harry Cooper, ironically no relation, was mounting losses. But there was good news. Henry was awarded an OBE in the New Year's Honours List, and Henry recalled this magical moment by saying, "It was marvellous. The Queen looked round straight away as my name was called, and she smiled a wonderful smile as I walked towards her. She knew about my boxing because at the time I'd been having knee trouble and she asked me about it. I told her it was a lot better and that I was back in training, and she said, 'It's marvellous to see you again.'" That was probably, for him, that was probably one of the defining moments of his life, I think, being able to go to the Queen and get that OBE, and of course the Queen taking an interest in what he actually did. And, you know, I think I've seen him in interviews post that moment speaking so highly about it.
Yeah, and I mean, that's his second meeting with her. He goes for a lunch and dinner in Buckingham Palace. He's back in Buckingham Palace to collect his OBE, and I mean, he, by the sounds of it, he was made up, and he was a real royalist fan as well, as you know, a lot of people were. Not probably so much today. It's starting to get better, but yeah, he really adored the royal family, and Henry did go on to defend his European title, win his only fight in 1969 with a fifth round knockout of Italian Piero Tommasoni, who was 33-6-5 before winning twice more in 1970, which is a points win over Jack Bordell, who was 53-9 in their rematch, and then defended the European title against Spaniard Jose Manuel Utain, who was 31-1 by a stoppage in the ninth. Now, both were at the Empire Paul Wembley. This was the same year that Henry picked up his second Spotty Award, and he was also the subject of This Is Your Life in 1970 when he was surprised by Eamon Andrews at Thames Television Euston Radio Studios.
Well, in Cooper's last professional fight at the age of 36, he fought an up-and-coming 21-year-old Joe Bugner, who was 31-2-1, again at the Empire Pool in Wembley. And it was a close fight, and one that our listeners should certainly go back and watch, just for scoring purposes, because it was that damn close. Now, Bugner didn't really do enough to take the title from Henry, but he was actually awarded the decision on points by referee Harry Gibbs. Henry said in 2008, "I knew it wasn't my best performance, but I still thought I'd nicked it." Following the defeat, Henry Cooper finally decided to retire from boxing, but he was still considered to be the people's champion, no matter what the outcome of his final fight was.
Yeah, so with boxing finished, a new chapter opened for Henry, and that was television. And he went on to become a regular on the TV screens, whether that be in films, quiz shows, interviews, or adverts. He was famous for coining that phrase, "splash it all over," in the Brute after shows. You can see all that. They're actually quite funny. Got Kevin Keegan's in one of them, and some of the other stars. And the other one was "get your flu jab." And when he basically urged vulnerable groups to go to their doctors for vaccination against influenza. And in 2000, age 66, he met the Queen for the third time to be knighted, and he became Sir Henry Cooper. I mean, you can't get any better. I mean, he's literally old pals with the Queen now at this point. He was and still is the only boxer to receive the honour. Now, he was generous, he was selfless. People mattered to Henry, not possessions. So much so that every bit of boxing memorabilia that he had kept through the years, including the gloves he wore against Ali in 1963, that same gloves that he floored him in that round, were auctioned off with the proceeds given to charity. Now, the only things he kept close to him were those 3 Lonsdale belts, and they were symbols of everything that he had achieved in the sport. And speaking in 1979, he said, "Winning each one of these belts brings back a certain memory, and they are the highlights of my career."
But unfortunately, in 1993, he was forced to part with them belts due to him losing a substantial amount in the Lloyd's crash. He found himself in debt. It was either the belts or his house, and of course he chose the belts. When Albina passed away from a heart attack aged 71 in 2008, Henry became more subdued, but he was still doing the odd bit of television to bring in a wage. Henry described Albina, who hated his sport, as an ideal wife for a boxer, never grumbling about his long absences before big fights and inviting journalists in for tea when they waited for Cooper to get out of bed the morning after bouts. 2 years later, his brother George unfortunately also passed away, a year before Henry himself died of natural causes on May the 1st, 2011 in Limpsfield. Muhammad Ali, this is what he had to say on Henry Cooper's death. "I am at a loss for words over the death of my friend Henry Cooper. I was not aware he was ill." And we've put together a little list of celebrity tributes now about Henry Cooper, and this just goes to show you how much of admiration people had for him, from people here in the UK to even people abroad. So the first one was Sir Bobby Charlton, who was a famous football player here in England. "He was just magical, not your normal boxer." The writer for The Sun and author of many books, Colin Hart, said he was a great British and European champion, a true gentleman. Sir Michael Parkinson, well known for his chat show over the course of the last 40-50 years, he said, "Very British, very decent, very unshowy. He had the wonderful left hand that would knock out anybody, including Muhammad Ali." Now, Muhammad Ali's trainer, Angelo Dundee, also had this to say about Henry Cooper. Henry Cooper was the nicest human being that God ever put on this earth.
Wow.
Another heavyweight, our good old Frank Bruno, who kind of really followed suit and took that mantelpiece of the People's Champion, I think. A decent human being, a proper man, a wonderful, warm, loving person. That was Henry Cooper. And comedian Jimmy Tarbuck, who was also an OBE, said he belonged to the public, and they felt that. He was a national treasure. Women, kids, and men all loved his company.
Well, real nice tribute there, and a lot of those, they're all talking on a short documentary that's on there just after his passing on YouTube, and yeah, it's actually quite an emotional watch when he discusses, his sons discuss the relationship he had with his mother, and how she just couldn't watch his fights. There is actually footage of her vaguely listening on the radio, and then she hears that he's cut, and she's like, "Oh my God!" She runs upstairs. And then she just actually sort of waited up there to find out that he's okay. And then she wouldn't go to bed until he come home. And it was just a great, they seemed to just have a lovely bond. And obviously the kids loved it. It was weird. Their dad on the radio and obviously their mum panicking about what he's going to come back like. But I honestly can't tell you how much this country loved Henry Cooper. He was just an absolute legend. And the fact that he comes literally from my neck of the wood, literally down the road where I went to school, where I was brought up, where I was basically born. He mentions Lewisham. I was born in Lewisham. I lived part of my life in Bellingham, and then I didn't live far from Grove Park, which is down just up the road where he stayed, and Bellingham as well. Very, very close together. I actually lived in Downham, which is down the road. It's just crazy. The fact that he trained for that second Ali fight in Welling, where I'm living now. It's just the craziest stories. When you do sort of, I always knew I loved Henry Cooper. I think now, after doing the research on him, I just love him even more. I just think what an absolute gent and a credit to the sport.
For me personally, Johnston, I think I knew a lot about Henry Cooper in terms of what he'd gone on to achieve in his career, but I didn't really know to the great extent what his life was like outside of the ring. I'll admit, I never really sat down and watched many documentaries about him, but as a boxing fan, as someone who obviously does a lot of research for boxing and for our podcasts, it was really, really enthralling to get a real feel for what Henry Cooper was really like outside of the ring, and how adored he was as not just a fighter but as a human being. And that's what you take away from this episode, from my perspective, is if you're listening to this now and you're in America or you're Canadian or you're Australian, some of the guys that listen from all different parts of the world to us, you probably know Henry Cooper from knocking Muhammad Ali down. That is what he's most famously known by for his career. But when you listen back to this now and you've gone through it and you think to yourself, actually, he did a lot more than what probably people give him credit for, really, when you think about it. The fact that he held 3 titles at one time, and the fact that he went in with 2 of the best of a certain generation, and yeah, he came up short, but he certainly gave Muhammad Ali a hell of a ride in that first fight, of course. And I'm really, really impressed with all his achievements throughout his career, and doing this podcast, doing this episode, has really put it into context how loved he was, how much of a great champion he was, and how much of a fantastic human being he was.
Yeah, and I think we've done that. I think you can. I mean, the fact that he come through as evacuee, he never lost those roots. He never allowed himself to get carried away with it all. Something that he was taught from a very young age, and I think that again, that's just something about him. He could have quite easily gone off the rails a little bit and been a bit of a Jack the Lad, but he never was. He was a very family orientated person, and he just loved being around people. People always say, he would spend too long at times with the fans. When he had a job to do. He's going to a TV studio. You find him outside signing autographs and chatting with people, and they're like, "Come on, Henry, we've got stuff to do," kind of thing. But that was him. He loved it, and I think the fact that he kept that working class thing about him, and he was so brave. And if he had better skin, if he had thicker skin, or he didn't get cut so bad, I think some of them fights that he lost, he wouldn't have lost, and I think he probably would have been a world champion. And it was a tough time to be a world champion, not like it is today. You don't get 4 chances at it. 4 different organisations. This was basically one belt. And that was it. You are identified as the one person. And you could imagine how hard that would be today. The arguments we have, who's the best world heavyweight champion at the minute, it's up for debate. But this day and age, it was never up for debate, unless sometimes the politics come into it. But Henry could have been a world champion. And the other thing people need to remember as well is that Henry Cooper was not a natural heavyweight. If he had fought today, he would have fought as a cruiserweight, and he would have been a small one at that.
Yeah, it's true, and people do forget that obviously the weight categories have gone up, and naturally, as human beings, we've evolved again over the last 50 years. People have got taller, they've got bigger, there's more science, there's more nutrition going into our bodies in this day and age, and there's a lot more sports science behind things now. So yeah, like you say, he probably would have been a possibly a light heavyweight, even light heavyweight to cruiserweight, and who knows, what he could have achieved. But back then, at that period of time, heavyweight was the category that he was in, and he was in an era of time with the likes of Floyd Patterson, Ingemar Johansson, Sonny Liston was around, remember, and then obviously you had Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali coming through as well. So these are four names that in their own right are legendary names, all world champions, every single one of them. And the fact that Henry Cooper shared the ring with three out of them four names and was close to fighting Sonny Liston at one point, of course, until his manager said no. He could have gone down as an even bigger legend. Just imagine, like, if them cuts weren't as bad as what they were. Just imagine what would have happened. I know it's all pure speculation and fantasy, but it begs the question, really. Like, what could have happened if science was better then? What could have happened if he was able to look after his face and his skin better, and he was able to do things to him earlier on in his career that would have allowed him to be different in the ring, fight harder in the ring, not be worried about cuts in the ring. I'm pretty sure he must have had reservations for every fight, worrying that he was going to get cut. I mean, he never would have admitted that, of course he wouldn't, but he must have had doubts in his mind about that, I'm going to get caught again, I'm going to get hit, I'm going to get cut again. It probably made him have to fight the way he did, because he knew if he didn't go in there and get some of these fellas out of there, he's probably going to end up getting stopped and cuts himself. So it just goes to show you that this guy had a lot of adversity to overcome, and adversity that he did overcome, and obviously he picked up all them titles, and it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it, and again, I forgive us for not remembering who actually recommended it. I've got a feeling it's you, Martin Lee. I've got a feeling you've recommended this one to us, and if it was you, thank you. If it was anybody else and we forgot who it is, thank you, because we really appreciate going through a different career profile. I mean, we've done some of the biggest names of the sport, of course, but to do someone like Henry Cooper, who doesn't necessarily get that recognition, or is not necessarily well known by a worldwide audience, then it's great to put this across to people and let them actually be able to go back now and look at his career and watch the documentaries that we refer to, and be able to understand how such a humble, great guy he was.
Yeah, and I urge anyone to go back, look at some of his fights, the ones that we've mentioned there and the ones that are there. There are a few, I think, sort of later on in the late 60s. Obviously, the Cassius Clay, aka obviously now Muhammad Ali, as we know him, both of them are on there on YouTube. But I think they were both on closed circuit. There was a problem as well, which we didn't mention, with a closed circuit fight, and he tried to get it on national terrestrial television, but apparently it didn't happen in the second fight. It was literally a certain amount of cinemas you could go in and watch it, otherwise you had to listen to it on the radio. Because obviously around the time, I think they had the World Cup obviously on the 66, so that was on television. Yeah, they're all trying to earn money out of it, unfortunately. I think that's one thing you always find. And the other thing is the fact that him and Jim Wicks didn't ever fall out. They remained friends for a long time, and Wicks helped him in every way he could to get him into that celebrity side of things, so he was all right when he come out of boxing. Yeah, it's just a great one to do. I'm really pleased we finally got to do Henry Cooper, serve Henry Cooper. Yeah, I just think, if anything, just brave. He was just a brave in battle, and he was dignified in defeat. That's just one thing I can always say about him. He was, and whether he won or lost, he was graceful about it, and the British public loved him. And I think that's if you're going to take anything and from our Henry, it's that an absolute legend.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to discuss the career of Sir Henry Cooper on this episode of Career Profiles. Of course, if you've enjoyed it, then let us know on Twitter at career_profiles, or on the BTR Boxing Podcast Network Facebook page. Give us a review on there. Let us know what you think. If you've not already subscribed to the Career Profiles podcast, then you can do so by checking us out on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify. We're on Spreaker, we're on Stitcher, we're on many, many podcast apps out there. Please go and search Career Profiles and subscribe to us if you haven't already. If you're already subscribing and have been subscribing for a while, big shout out to you, because we really appreciate the fact that you're listening to it and giving us the feedback. And thank you so much for all that feedback as well, because we truly appreciate it. It gives us the inspiration to continue to bring you different career profiles, putting more hours of time into research these fighters and bring you something that you may have not even heard before. I mean, we find things that we've not even heard before, and obviously we're boxing fanatics and we love to be able to look into the depths of this type of stuff. So we hope you've really enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you on the next episode of Career Profiles.